Is the current extreme gerrymandering by both parties killing competitive democracy in America? If you leave this video with only one thought, it should be this. If left unchecked, this modern era of extreme weaponized gerrymandering is a mutually assured destruction scenario. It is a runaway train that will eventually destroy both major political parties and completely kill competitive democracy as we know it. Hello? And thank you for giving a new YouTube channel a chance. I'm Mr. Chameleon. Okay, here we go. Welcome to Chameleon Perspectives, where you will get honest and informative news analysis with a little bit of humor on the side. Let's talk about maps. We're not talking about the map on your phone that occasionally insists you drive your car directly into a lake, but the political maps, the invisible lines that quite literally dictate who holds the levers of power in the United States. Today, we are looking at a system that has been manipulated, stretched, and tortured so far beyond its original intent that the founding fathers could power a small city with the rotational energy of their spinning graves. However, and this is a silver lining we desperately need right now, we, the people, still hold the ultimate power to pull the emergency brake and prevent this dystopian future from becoming the inheritance we pass to our children. Do you remember the classic 5-paragraph essay format that you learned back in your secondary education? Let's update that tried and true formula for the YouTube era and break this down into three main points. We're going to cover how we stumbled into this mess, why the current map wars are an existential threat to democracy, and the structural reforms we can do right now to save our republic. Let's dive in. Point 1. The maps of madness and the dawn of maximum warfare. Let's start with how we got here and why this maximum warfare began in the first place. Gerrymandering isn't new. In fact, it's named after Elbridge Gerry, a Massachusetts governor back in 1812, who signed a bill that created a district in the Boston area that looked remarkably like a mythological salamander, hence gerrymander. For a couple of centuries, it was an accepted, slightly sleazy part of the American political tradition. The party in power in a state legislature would tweak the margins, protect a few incumbents, and maybe nudge a competitive district a couple points in their favor. It was gerrymandering with a butter knife. But then came the 2010 midterm election cycle. The Republican Party, seeing a massive wave election forming, executed a brilliant and utterly ruthless strategy known as Red Map, the Redistricting Majority Project. They recognized that they could capture enough state legislatures in key battleground states right before the 2010 census. They could control the pens that drew the maps, and that would mean they would control the maps for the entire next decade. Frankly, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But this time, they didn't use a butter knife. They used supercomputers and incredibly granular voter data to draw maps with surgical, laser-guided precision. They cracked and packed Democratic voters so effectively that in several states, Democrats could win hundreds of thousands more votes statewide, and yet still walk away with a minority of the seats in the state house and the congressional delegation. It was an absolute masterclass in partisan cartographic engineering. For the next decade, Democrats complained loudly, waving their arms and shouting about the unfairness of it all. As someone who admittedly leans a little bit moderate center-left, I watched with concern as Democrats tried to take the high road. In states where Democrats had power, or where citizens leaned liberal, they pushed for independent redistricting commissions. They thought unilateral disarmament would inspire a national movement of fairness. But as it turns out, bringing an idealistically worded agenda to a map-drawing knife fight is a terrible strategy. Fast forward to the post-2020 census redistricting cycle. Democrats finally woke up, and they chose violence. Recognizing that independent commissions in blue states were costing them seats while red states ruthlessly maximized their advantages, Democrats in states like New York, Illinois, and Maryland decided to fight fire with a flamethrower. They began drawing maps just as brutally skewed as anything the GOP had produced in Texas or Ohio. They started targeting Republican incumbents, shredding competitive districts, and trying to lock in massive, unassailable majorities. Suddenly, both sides were engaged in maximum warfare. It was no longer about protecting a couple of incumbents. It was about the complete and total annihilation of the opposing party's political power within state borders. What it meant was the era of the swing district was dead, or at least dying. It was replaced by the era of partisan fortresses. We transitioned from an imperfect republic to a cartographic arms race where both sides were perfectly willing to burn down the concept of competitive elections, if it meant they got to rule the ashes. Point 2. The doom loop of unchecked gerrymandering. This brings us to our second point, the terminal risks that unchecked gerrymandering poses to competitive democracy. The damage here is twofold, and both aspects are incredibly toxic to a functioning government and a functioning society. First, extreme gerrymandering effectively steals the power of choice directly from the hands of the electorate. In a healthy democracy, the voters choose their politicians. Under our current AI-driven algorithmic map-drawing paradigm, the politicians choose their voters. We've handed the sacred duty of representative democracy over to partisan cartographic warriors and data scientists whose only goal is total political domination. When a district is drawn so that one party or the other is guaranteed at least a 15-point victory before a single ballot is cast, the general election becomes a meaningless charade. Your vote in November is reduced to almost ceremonial symbolic gestures. The people already in office have insulated themselves from consequences and accountability. They are building impenetrable moats around their careers. They don't have to listen to you or their critics because you have already been mapped out of the political equation. Second, and perhaps even more terrifyingly, the system creates an increasingly radicalized partisan flywheel dynamic. Think about the basic incentives of a competitive district. If a politician wants to win an election where the electorate is somewhat evenly divided, they have to appeal to the middle. They have to compromise. They have to moderate their rhetoric, and they actually have to govern. Now, take a moment after this video is done, and please comment below. Tell me, is your representative more focused on governing or performative outrage for their base? What happens when you replace all these competitive districts with hyper-partisan districts drawn to be like plus 15 or plus 20 for one party or the other? In these plus 15, plus 20 districts, a general election is a foregone conclusion. The only real threat to a sitting politician's re-election is a primary challenge from the extreme fringe of their own party. If you're a Republican in a deep red district on the right, your only fear is someone running far to your right, accusing you of being a rhino because you didn't scream loudly enough on cable news or expressed even the mildest criticism of Trump. If you're a Democrat in a deep blue district on the left, your only fear is someone running far to your left, calling you a moderate Trump enabler for failing to resist sufficiently, or a corporate sellout because you compromised on a minor piece of legislation. This dynamic violently punishes moderation and richly rewards performative outrage. Partisan extremism is financially and politically incentivized. Those extreme voices hold the keys to the kingdom because the maps have been specifically drawn to ensure that only the loudest, most uncompromising candidates survive the primary process, where only the most motivated and often activist and extreme voters from both parties actually vote. We're trapped in a doom loop where politicians only speak to their rabid base, passing no legislation, solving no problems, and raising millions of dollars off of manufactured outrage and anger on both sides. But hold on, don't tune out, don't go off the grid, and move into a cabin in the woods just yet. I want to finish this point on a hopeful note because we, the people, we still have the power to end this era of maximum warfare. We can bring sanity back to this redistricting battle. Take a look at what's happening in Missouri right now. Citizen-led groups are fighting back, using the power of the referendum to invalidate the legislature's gerrymandered map. The legislature carved up Kansas City along historical racial dividing line, Troost Avenue, to gut the previously safe urban 5th district. They split off the predominantly black neighborhoods and placed them in a district stretching deep into the rural farming communities of central Missouri. The citizens of Kansas City have rebelled and looked at the ridiculous map and said, no, we reject this. Now, the legislature is fighting to invalidate the signatures on the referendum before they can be certified. But the state Supreme Court recently ruled in a narrow 4-3 decision that the new maps can remain in place until a special election is held. This is a short-term setback, but that 4-3 ruling tells you that this battle is far from over. But make no mistake, it takes real determination and perseverance to overcome the gerrymander army. Now, this doesn't have to be a partisan issue. The solutions don't need to be partisan either. Voters across the ideological spectrum, from principled conservatives on the right and moderate liberals on the left, they all want their values represented, without the performative outrage from the far right or the far left. The center, center-left moderates, they just want their government to fix the roads and leave them alone. We can unite behind the concept of a government that fairly represents all views and not just the polar extremes. We can support referendums and ballot initiatives in our home states to take the power of drawing maps out of the hands of elected officials. We can support independent commissions that work best when they are implemented nationally and universally. We can pressure the people in power to hand over their map-making pens to independent bodies who have the interests of the people in mind. And we can even demand that our elected officials legislate to end gerrymandering on a federal level, rather than protecting politicians' cushy jobs. We just need the courage to demand better from our elected officials. Point 3, the democracy upgrade, electoral structural reforms. If taking the pens away from the politicians is a short-term band-aid, we need a long-term structural surgery to fix the underlying disease. Our third leg of the proverbial three-legged stool is the potential game-changing electoral structural reforms that could bring our representative republic into the 21st century. I'm talking about ranked choice voting, fusion voting, electoral party slate voting, and drastically expanding the size of the House. Let's break these down. First, ranked choice voting. Right now, if there are 3 candidates, you often have to vote for the lesser of 2 evils, because voting for the third party candidate you actually like might act as a spoiler, handing the election to your worst nightmare. Ranked choice voting fixes this. You rank your candidates, first choice, second choice, third choice. If your first choice comes in dead last, they're eliminated, but your vote instantly transfers to your second choice. This allows voters to actually vote with their conscience, without fear, and it forces candidates to appeal to a broader base, because they need the second choice votes of their opponent's supporters in order to win. Suddenly, being a toxic, polarizing jerk is a losing strategy. Second, let's look at fusion voting. This is a system that allows multiple political parties to cross-endorse the same candidate. This was the norm in American elections all the way into the early 1900s, before the two-party system worked together to outlaw it, because they saw it as a threat to their duopoly. So let's say there's a moderate Republican running. They can be on the ballot under the Republican line, but also under the moderate party line or the conservative party line. Votes for the candidates in all of their lines are added together. This gives third parties actual leverage, because it allows voters to send a highly specific signal. I'm voting for this candidate, but I'm voting from the center, not from the extremes on the left or the right. It empowers moderates to pull major candidates back towards the middle. Third, we have electoral party slate voting, also known as proportional representation. This is the norm in many parliamentary democracies around the world, including New Zealand, which actually switched from our winner-take-all system in 1996, and in Germany. Imagine if instead of carving the state into tiny winner-take-all districts, a state elected representatives proportionally based on the total statewide vote. Let's say a state has 10 seats. The Democrats win 60%, while the Republicans win 40%. If a state has 10 seats and the Democrats win 60%, while the Republicans win 40%, the state sends 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans to Washington. Period. No lines to gerrymander. No cracking, no packing, just perfectly apportioned representation. While you would no longer simply be voting for an individual candidate, you would still be voting for your party preference, and each party would provide a slate of their candidates in order of priority prior to the election. That means if you know your party's going to win about 40%, you know the 4 people that are going to be elected. Or if your party's going to win 60%, you know the 6 people that's going to be elected. So you still know who you're voting for. Finally, let's talk about expanding the number of seats in the House. The size of the U.S. House has been artificially capped at 435 since 1929. Back then, each member of Congress represented about 280,000 people. Today, that number is over 760,000. It is impossible for one person to effectively represent the diverse and nuanced needs of 750,000 constituents. By doubling the number of House seats or more, we make districts smaller, more localized, and vastly more competitive. It lowers the barrier of entry for normal citizens to run for office, and it dilutes the power of big money. This makes gerrymandering exponentially much more difficult. This isn't a solution that just benefits racial or ethnic minorities either. Consider the stark reality of a gerrymandered winner-take-all map. While the 17.8 million Trump-leaning residents in Texas enjoy robust representation, California's 15.2 million Trump-leaning residents are virtually silenced, despite comprising nearly 40% of that state's population. Supporters of either party living in areas where the other party dominates can still earn representation if we aren't afraid to reform our electoral system. Imagine the benefits of combining multiple reforms and what that could accomplish. A conservative living in a deep blue urban area like Seattle or Brooklyn would finally be able to help elect a representative who shares their views, rather than having their vote swallowed up by a sea of blue. A liberal living in rural Wyoming or Texas Panhandle would finally have a voice. Minorities in all areas would have a real mathematical chance to elect representatives that reflect their realities, no longer cartographically swamped by a regional manufactured majority. Every vote would carry real weight everywhere. The geographic sorting that currently divides our country into red rural areas and blue cities would finally loosen its stranglehold on our politics. Conclusion: saving our republic. To bring this all home and reaffirm our original thesis, out of control, extreme gerrymandering is a terminal cancer on the body politic. It is an existential threat to competitive democracy that acts as a supercharger for political extremism, performative outrage, and the utter paralysis of our government. If we continue to let politicians pick their voters, we are guaranteeing a future where the loudest, most partisan voices rule over the silent, exhausted majority. But as dark as that sounds, the final chapter has not been written. There are solutions right here, right in front of us. In the short term, support citizen referendums and ballot initiatives. Claw map drawing power away from state legislatures and hand it to independent commissions. In the medium term, advocate for local and state movements for ranked choice voting and fusion voting to break free from the grip of partisan extremists. And in the long term, fight for a national movement for basic electoral structural reform, like proportional representation and using party slate voting, and uncapping and at least doubling the number of representatives in the House. We need courage and fortitude to actually preserve this republic, because the politicians, they aren't going to do it for us. Thank you for making it this far in the video. If you found this video useful or informative, please, very gently, tap the like and subscribe buttons. And tell me in the comments which reforms you support and why. Now, in the interest of full disclosure and transparency, this script was developed with AI assistance based on my comprehensive original framework and primary source research. Come back for more of my views between the clowns on the left and the jokers on the right. And I'll keep delivering the bald-faced truth as I see it. Stay informed, keep your politicians accountable, and never lose hope.